All right. So here we are, everybody. Welcome to episode 5 of the Unashamed Truth podcast. We're continuing our series that we had started 2 weeks ago. We'd like to take a second to just welcome everybody who is watching this live with us on our different channels, either YouTube or Facebook. Um, I just wanted to, before we get started into our topics and introduce our guests and stuff like that with us this week, I just wanted to take a second to just thank everybody who subscribed in the last month.
Yes,
Um, so we've hit the 1 month mark of our podcast that was started totally on a whim, totally on one of those adrenaline rushed moments where we're like, let's do this. And surprisingly, we had in our first month close to 70 subscribers. So we just want to thank you guys for paying attention to what we're doing. At first, I wasn't sure what type of reception this would receive. I'm sure that's kind of the case for you, Gift, and Dwight as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
But it's been overwhelming to see the response, and we just want to thank you guys for joining us, and you're encouraging us to keep doing what we're doing. So thank you so much for joining with us week by week as we discuss these topics. We're by no means any professionals on any of these topics that we discuss, but it's just great to see the interaction and to get your feedback from what we've been doing. On that topic, I also want to just take a moment to always remind you guys, we love to have you guys send us messages throughout the discussion. So if you have questions on any of the topics that we're discussing today, if you want to ask our guests anything that comes to mind, please send us a comment in our chat and in the comment section of our videos, and we'll be more than glad to acknowledge them and go ahead and ask the questions. So to that, I would like to turn over to Gift and to Dwight for them to introduce our guests as we start diving into this interesting topic. Gift, you want to talk about the topic today?
Sure. So today's topic is called "Am I Disabled Enough?" And we're going to be talking about invisible disabilities and how those impact people in different areas of life and how they're perceived by society largely. So we have our wonderful guests, Christelle and Sal. I'll let first Dwight introduce Christelle, and then I'll be introducing Sal in a moment.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, everybody, thanks again. Like everybody's been saying, definitely appreciate it. And I have the pleasure of introducing my very good friend Christelle to the podcast tonight to talk about the subject at hand. She is a strong businesswoman and a leader in her community, and a very, very strong example that I'm very happy to have here to discuss with us tonight. So, Christelle, welcome to the podcast, and I can't wait to talk more with you.
All right.
Yeah. Welcome, Christelle.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd like to introduce my friend Sal. Sal is very much involved within community work and disability-related issues, and every time we hang out, we're always talking about either philosophical stuff or social justice-y stuff, and we'll just have a good go at each other. And when this series came up, I thought it would be great to have him on board and just to have him share his experiences and his thoughts about everything that he's experienced throughout his time. Yeah. So, do you have anything to say before we begin?
Not really, except for thanks for having me and thinking of me and inviting me to this podcast and thinking I have something to contribute to the conversation.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us, Sal. Hey, Sal, I have a question for you real quick before we get started.
Sure.
Is Gift always this much of a revolutionary? Even at work?
He's actually been worse sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, shoot.
I have a little story. About the revolutionary look.
Okay.
You can blame this on Sam, okay? Yo, you need to put your retro glasses on. you have these. What's up? What's going on? How come you never wear them? So I started wearing them in the office. I'm self-conscious about these glasses. So it's always been very encouraging for me to show my revolutionary side.
Nice. And now he's going to come back to the office with a little bit of a fro too, so it's going to be brilliant. We'll make sure he has an afro pick to rock while he's scooting around the office.
That's it. He's already got a boombox on his chair. So this is perfect.
Yeah. If he starts directing black and white film, you know that he's followed down the path of Spike Lee. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sal and Christelle. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge two people that have written to us so far. So we have Joseph, Joey, who was with us a few weeks ago on the podcast. He's going to be trying to follow along a little bit. He has to put the kids to bed. But hey, Joey, thanks for joining us today.
Joey.
And we also heard from Alexis Desplan, who was, I remember from Evangel way back in the day. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for inviting your friends to the podcast, Alexi. We're happy to be able to create this space to discuss these topics. So thanks for supporting us. So cool. So I wanted to start off by asking a question that's going to be like a fill in the blank sort of question. So it's going to be an open-ended statement, and I would like you guys to kind of say what comes to mind. So my question is going to be, I think we lost Sal.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is going to be, all disabilities are not treated, fill in the blank.
Equally.
Okay. Gift, what would you? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Equitably. Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So equally, Chriselle, expand on why you would say that.
Sure. It's mostly based on perception.
Okay.
People's perception ends up being very different from one disability to another. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is a visible disability. Someone who either is visually impaired and has a walking stick. You can automatically, you kind of guess what's going on. Someone who's in a wheelchair, you see them, you assume that they're, they have issues walking. Other sicknesses, it's a little harder. So the perception, people's view of what that person goes through, what they have to deal with, is completely different from one thing to another. I think about a sickness like cancer, which is so popular in across the world in different conversations. People tend to go off a lot of the information they have fed there, but definitely for sicknesses that are or disabilities that are a little less well known, it's a little different in terms of how people view it and what they think of it all.
Mm-hmm. I get you. And Gift?
So what I meant by equitably is that most people assume that if you have an disability X, this is the type of support that you need, or you must experience these barriers or these symptoms because most people with X disability require this this Y support.
Okay.
Yeah.
So almost like we kind of paint disabilities with too broad of a stroke.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we either define how people are when they experience them, or even, I guess, in our approach to solving some of these issues related to how to help people with disability.
Yeah.
And that to me is a very interesting topic. So for those of you who watch the podcast who don't quite know what I do, so like I work in the field of architecture, and I'm getting now kind of into the side. I'm leaving the industrial sector where we worked on these big industrial plants where the assumption is that if you're working in these environments, you're somebody who's fully able-bodied. Therefore, you don't need certain adaptations of the code that are written specifically for people with certain types of disabilities. And now I'm going more into the transit sector, which is the sector that's booming right now. And now I'm having to kind of learn the parts of the code that I put on the side, to understand really what is it that we have to consider when we're looking at people who are living, who are mobility, who have reduced mobility, and so on. So this is a kind of perfect timing to have this discussion, because I'm just excited to learn so much that I've probably ignored for years, you know. Yeah. So we had some questions written out. I don't know, Gift, if you wanted to start to go through these questions.
All right. I'm just curious, Crystal, if have you always identified as a person with a disability?
Was I always identified? Was that the question?
Yeah, have you always identified as someone with a disability, all your life, or is that something that?
Well, to answer the question, I think it might be interesting to explain to you what it is that I actually have. So I deal with 3 different autoimmune sicknesses. And the first one is fibromyalgia. And that's actually a sickness that was only recognized by the World Health Organization in 1994. So it's been really just a few years, if you think about it, just to get it approved and recognized as a sickness. And even in some countries, it still isn't really recognized in terms of being able to get access to disability help and all that stuff. So that's the first one that I deal with. The second one I have is arthritis, which is very popular, but more with an elder population, not someone that's young as I am. And the other one I have is ankylosing spondylitis, which is essentially inflammation in the joint, in the sacroiliac joint, which is in around your lower back, and creates a lot of pain. So it's mostly chronic pain that I deal with. And just to get diagnosed took a really long time. I started having chronic pain at the age of 15. And was only officially diagnosed with fibromyalgia at the age of 22. So I went through 7 years of tests and being bounced around from doctor to specialist, just trying to figure it out. So just to finally be recognized as someone who has a disability, if you will, that alone took time. So it wasn't just about me recognizing it or identifying, but it was even getting it medically recognized. So I always felt that from a young age that, I did have pains that weren't normal. So I knew something was wrong with me, but it took a while just to be able to understand everything around it, and to finally say, hey, you know what? I actually do have something legit. It's not in my head. I'm not crazy. I'm not exaggerating or being sensitive. And I think from that moment on, I started really recognizing that I'm not like every other kid running on the street. I'm not like every other young adult that, is just being lazy or sleeping 55 hours a night just because they don't really want to get up for no reason. But it was more like I really have a struggle. And I think that's really what helped me to identify. Once I started to identify, I started to be able to find solutions.
Interesting.
So that must have been somewhat liberating in a sense to to finally have a diagnosis.
Yeah, it's I would say the most bittersweet thing ever, because for 7 years I was dealing with chronic pain, not knowing what I had, and having to almost prove to the doctors and the specialists that there really is something. I really am suffering, because fibromyalgia is not something that you can detect in your typical MRIs or blood tests or X-rays or any of that. So part of you becomes relieved when you finally get a diagnosis. It's like, hey guys, this whole time I was telling the truth. Right. And then you end up finding out okay, this is something I'm going to have to continue dealing with on a longer term basis. So yeah, you're relieved, but at the same time, you're like, it's not something that's going to go away in the next 6 months. It's something I'm going to have to learn to deal with and find ways to cope.
Right.
I see.
Yeah. And Sal, for you, like, have you always identified as someone with a disability, or do you want to even give a background a little bit of your disability?
Yeah, I guess I give a bit of a small background. It's actually interesting because fibromyalgia is kind of in the same sort of family of connective tissue disorders that I also experience. It's called Marfan syndrome. Historical background, Abraham Lincoln probably had it. He's really tall, gangly, stuff like that. So there's been documented cases of it throughout history, but it only really got classified as a syndrome maybe 115 years ago. So it was diagnosed at birth with a different set of criteria. But then in 2011, that criteria changed. So for a good 3 or 4 years, no one really knew what I had. But during that time, I went through a bunch of surgeries that could only be attributed to Marfan syndrome. So I went blind twice. I've had 5 eye surgeries, a lot of chest surgeries, some neurological problems, and so on. But I also experienced, like Christelle, chronic pain as well. So it's multi-systemic, and it just encompasses my whole body, really. But it's funny because when I was being raised as a kid, no one really understood what I was going through. They just understood that maybe I perhaps had a heart problem, but it just kind of ended there, like a heart and eye problem. But there was never a serious indication about like, oh, well, maybe it's affecting his sense of pain or, this or that. But I only started to identify, to answer your question, as a disabled person, maybe 4 years ago, and I started thinking about my syndrome more seriously and started considering it something that could be considered a disability, because for most of my life, I considered something with a disability to be more visible. But only when I started educating myself and speaking with others that I realized that it does count as an invisible disability.
So that's surprising. So you yourself did not initially identify as somebody as having a disability.
Yeah, I don't think I was socialized to see it as a disability. So, when I was growing up, it was just pushed aside as growing pains. If I had eye problems, it's like, oh, maybe it's just a lazy eye. If I have problems with my heart, it's, well, maybe that's just a symptom of it, but it's not symptomatic of a disability. And that criteria started to change, I think, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when I probably took it more seriously.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, so as your circle of friends came to understand, I guess, that you are somebody with a disability, how was the reaction? Like, was there a shift in how they perceived you? And
I would say it's a gradual shift, because I think that my friends originally probably wouldn't have thought of me as having one. But, I usually had to go for the most extreme examples. Like, let's say, for example, one of my eye surgeries, after my second one, I had a needle put into my eye because there was too much gas. And that's an entire story into itself. But anytime I had to describe myself as being someone who was disabled, I had to justify it with some sort of story. I couldn't just say I'm disabled, because then they would say, oh, you can walk, you can move, you can do all these things. So why are you stealing this word kind of from that population? Gradually, they started to accept that, I can't do some of the things that normal people, or quote unquote normal people could do. So, yeah.
I see.
And like when you disclosed to your friends, was it also within that same timeline, like 4 years ago, when you first started identifying as a disabled person?
Well, I think the first time would have been in kindergarten, because we always had to be careful that when I was playing with kids that they didn't push on my chest, because that could cause like an aortic rupture. So I usually had to explain it that early on. But I think that the first real memory I have of describing it to someone is that they understood it as a disease and they thought I could spread it to them. I was maybe like 14 or something. And yeah, they thought, I'm like, dude, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to spread it to you. It's not going to work.
It's not catching. It's not corona, guys.
It's not coronavirus, But yeah, I did have to sort of go through that process of describing exactly what it is, because it is a rare genetic disorder, and rare genetic disorders aren't usually well known. So usually it involves me getting into like a mini lecture about this whole thing. Yeah.
I see.
I think for my part, the greatest reaction that I got out of people was really shock. My very closest friends knew from the get-go, you know, that I was suffering with pain and that I was being tested for different things. Most people did not know to what extent. So I guess I didn't really take it maybe too seriously, or didn't think it was anything major. And then I only really came out with it, I would say in 2016, I did a post on social media to raise awareness of what I had. And the response that I got was completely overwhelming, because it was on social media. It was sent to people that knew me, and a lot of people who've known me for a very long time. And a lot of the responses that I got were just complete shock, because when you look at me, I look perfectly healthy. If you follow me on social media, you'll see that all my posts are showing me being active in all kinds of different ways. And so the last thing anyone thinks when they see me is that I have some sort of sickness, disability, or there's something wrong with my health. So the initial reaction was shock. Unfortunately, I do have to say that the second reaction from a lot of people that I got was everyone started playing doctor.
Oh,
The ones that like, oh, my cousin's grandmother's aunt's uncle has something that's a bit similar, and then they just start like dishing out every single home remedy. Yeah.
But I'm curious how you guys have managed that, in terms of like people starting to prescribe you things to air quote cure. Like how have you guys?
I was very diplomatic in how I answered those questions or things, because usually what I got was, oh, you should see a doctor or a surgeon and maybe they can fix you. Like they would actually use that word sometimes. And then I would just sort of like be, well, you know, it's not something that essentially needs to be fixed. It's something that needs to be sort of, you know, taken care of or maintained or whatever. So I would pull them away from that sort of perspective where I have something that necessarily needs to be fixed or could be fixed. Because the syndrome itself is incurable, right? Like I'm going to have it until I die, basically. So explaining it that way makes it a bit different, because I think sometimes if I say like, no, I've had eye surgeries, they think that there's a solution to all those problems. They go get a robotic eye or something, or replace this body part with this body part, or you know, something like that. So it's like, it's strange. It goes into science fiction really quickly, and like, oh. Because also there's this thing called CRISPR that can modify RNA, and they're like, well, what if you had your RNA modified? And
Yeah,
that's not how it works. You know?
Oh gosh.
Oh boy.
And Krista?
I'd say it is with a lot of diplomacy. You have to understand that for the most part, the people who have come forward and try to share with you whatever it is that, you know, whether it's an article online or whether it's through someone in their family that has something similar, whatever it is that they've given you in terms of advice, I've always kind of assumed that it came from a good place, from a well-intentioned heart. So when you take it with that approach, then you're a little bit more patient and you get a little less frustrated. Having said that, you do have the ones that do like to play the know-it-alls and try to pretty much impose on you, you know, like how many people have thrown at me the gluten-free diet and all those different things that have been going on. Let's go keto or who knows what, you know, like, and so that the part that was kind of harder to sift through and try to find the patience to deal with people. Some people I just, you know, eventually put aside and have decided to not continue talking about the subject with them, because it does get frustrating. It does get tiring. You get questioned a lot on everything that you do. It goes from you looked super healthy and we thought that everything was fine with you to suddenly, now that I know that you're sick, I see you doing something that, you know, it looks like you shouldn't be doing it because of your health. And then it's like, why are you doing this? Or how are you doing this? And then it ends up falling into judgment as well. And so it's kind of that whole combination of all those different things that you have to learn to navigate through in all the different relationships, because some people it's family, some people it's friends, some colleagues, and some total strangers who've heard your story, who reach out to you. So it is very tricky, no lies, it's tricky, and some days are definitely easier than others.
I get you.
A question came in from Paul, actually. I don't know if you can share that, Terry.
Yeah. Shout out to Paul. Hey, Paul.
Paul's my brother, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul. Sal, do you want to go ahead?
Let me read it. Do you still have to explain your disability to people as before? No, it depends on who you're speaking with. So some people who are in the know tend to be more understand. Like, how do I describe this? They tend to put their reservations aside so that they could actually listen. So thankfully, I've been able to meet some people like that. But I do still have to explain my disability to people who I would say don't have experience with people with disabilities or do not have a disability of themselves. So I guess quote unquote able-bodied people are usually the people who I still have to explain this to, and yeah, pretty much.
And what environments have you had or feel like obliged to disclose or the need to disclose?
It's interesting because there are some environments where I just forego explaining it at all or even disclosing it. Usually it's when I'm in an arena where I know that I don't have the space to explain. So usually what I try to do is, if I understand that the person is receptive to what I have to say and they're listening and compassionate, then I'll initiate the discussion. But if I see that they're hard and they're not really open to listening to what I have to say, then I usually kind of retract. So I usually gauge my interaction with the attitude that I'm getting from another person. I don't always go full out like, hey, I have more fans and I have all this and that. So I will gauge first before I initiate that discussion.
Well, first to answer Paul, I do have a lot to explain to people. When I tell people of arthritis, that for the most part, it's, oh, you're young, but then they understand it because their grandmother or their parents or somebody has it around them, and so they understand it a little bit more. Ankylosing spondylitis, which is an inflammation issue, people don't know anything about. And fibromyalgia is really the most controversial topic. If you go ahead and Google it, you'll find so much information that just kind of makes it such a controversial issue, in the sense that fibromyalgia is often recognized as a disability that is triggered by a trauma in your life. But it can also be brought upon for different reasons. And so the first thing is, people who do the basic Google search on fibromyalgia end up asking me, like, what trauma did you go through in your life that triggered it? And that's the part where you kind of have to explain, what, it's not a one size fits all, that what I deal with in my body is just what happens for me, and I can't speak for the person next to me. Yes, we can have, some symptoms and some issues in common, but the truth is that, especially with fibromyalgia, there are such different levels. You can have fibromyalgia and not be able to walk, to be either walking with a walker or be in a wheelchair because your body is that weak and unable to cope. Or you can be like me, highly functional, where I'm able to hold down a full-time job and I'm able to do a lot more because I really do push myself, and because maybe my level of pain is not as intolerable as it is for other people. So the hard part in explaining to people is really just helping them understand that it's a very personal thing, and that when you do your Google search, you'll get educated, yes, but you have to understand that not everything that's there applies necessarily to me. In terms even of government aid, it's been very recently that in Canada, the government has recognized it as an official disability. So they've rolled out programs for that. So just knowing that alone, you tell yourself, if for the government and the World Health Organization, it took so long to recognize it, then obviously your typical person walking down the street doesn't know very much about it. In terms of disclosing, Gift, you had asked about that. The place where I've had to actually disclose a little bit of it the most has been, weirdly enough, in the workplace. And I'm a director in IT consulting. So I hire people, I meet with clients, we do a lot of going out for lunches and having cocktails and all kinds of networking events like that. And the one thing that always comes up when I'm at a cocktail or at a dinner or something is, why aren't you drinking with us? Because it's the beer, it's the wine, it's the alcohol. And because of the meds that I take, I can't actually have any alcohol at all. So usually people end up asking me if it's for religious reasons. And I end up, or for cultural reasons, whatever it is. And then I end up telling them that it's not because I don't want to, it's because I actually can't. I can't mix my meds with alcohol. So oftentimes I'll open up the conversation if I see the person is interested and open to hearing what I have to say. Because sometimes people will push or they'll try to pressure you. And sometimes I'll just kind of, cut it dry and be like, well, I'm on medication right now, and so I can't really drink. And they'll usually leave me alone after that. But for the most part, I only talk about it if I feel that what I've gone through or what I am going through can actually help the other person that's in front of me. Either because they're going through their own struggles and we can end up relating on this subject, or I can encourage them some way, somehow. But for the most part, I found that sharing my story, other than raising awareness about what I have, has actually kind of complicated the relationships and complicated the conversations. You end up being thrown in a box with all these stereotypes, and it can really be unpleasant at times.
And I know Christelle well, so she's holding out a bit on this conversation because she pushes herself. I mean, she really pushes herself. So there's people that that could easily see everything that Christelle's doing and not and say, man, come on, you can't be disabled. So like, what's that like?
It's funny because even just to a few months ago, it was a big surprise for some of my colleagues. The first, I went in quarantine in mid-March, like most people. But the first 2 weeks of March, we'd been hearing a lot about COVID-19 and the potential that it had. And so because of that, the last week that I was in the office before we all got sent home, I actually had a sign on my door. I kept my door closed and I had a sign that said that I was there. And so people ended up calling instead of walking into my office. And people didn't understand why, because most people in the office had no idea that I had any issues whatsoever. So I ended up having to explain to people why. And even now, they're talking about slowly reintegrating people in the office. And it's been announced that I will be the last person because of the medication that I take. My defense mechanisms, my immune system is completely stripped down. So I don't have any defense mechanism. And that makes me a lot more vulnerable than I really look, because physically I look perfectly healthy. But the truth is that right now, COVID-19 is a giant threat for me just because of my health. And that's something that people do not understand. It's like, why are you so locked up? Why are you so, careful with every single thing? They're like, you're young, you're fine, everything's good with you. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not at all. And you don't want to make yourself look like, oh, I'm special and I'm unique and I'm all that, but you also don't have a choice sometimes.
Exactly. We have a question that came in from Maya. So she's saying, as someone who works with children with disabilities, is there anything you wish others knew or understood that would enable them to be more supportive and sensitive as they worked with children with disabilities? Thanks for the question, Maya.
Thank you.
So who wants to take it first?
I just finished talking, so you want to go ahead, Sal?
So the question again, if I understand it, is
I'll put it back.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Give me a second. Enable them to be more supportive and sensitive.
it was.
I would say, yeah, I guess I wish they understood it as like something that was affecting my entire body. Because I think growing up, and I'll say this again, is that, you know, my heart was really made kind of like the centerpiece of the syndrome. So, you know, I couldn't do sports and stuff, but there weren't any alternatives that would give it to me. So, you know, it was like either you're here doing stuff or you're here not doing stuff. So I think that giving children with disabilities other things that could be more recreative, acceptably recreative, could be something to help, because, you know, I didn't have that many options as a child with a disability now that I'm seeing. So maybe something like that, you know, have programs for children that recognize that they can't do the normal things that normal children can do. I would say something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay, cool. You, Christelle?
It's really an excellent question. I'm glad that was brought up. Thank you, Maya. For me, the first thing that I would love people to know and to be aware of is that I have a disability, I have a sickness, but it is not who I am. It's what I have to deal with on a daily basis, but there's more to me than that. And when I mentioned earlier that, you know, it complicates relationships when I mention the fact that I do have a disability, what ends up happening is that people just really put you in that box where they now define you as that, and they forget every other facet of who you are, of what you can do. And the limits for me, like I don't let other people place them on me. The problem is that other people try to do that, and I'm constantly fighting against it. I'm a highly motivated achiever. You know, Dwight was telling you that I really do push myself, and I do it for myself and nobody else. But it's hard because sometimes the people around you, they just kind of see you as the sick person, and so they right away like just kind of put a mark on what you can and can't do, and it's frustrating because I believe it's truly up to me to be able to define, you know, what it is I'm capable of doing or not. And it's frustrating when someone else tries to do it for me. At the same time, I do know that sometimes I can be a walking contradiction. And the reason I say that is because I go through ups and downs with the pain. And so one day can be a fantastic, excellent, almost pain-free day. And the next day I can be all the way down to the ground, just reeling in pain, barely able to do anything. And what I would really love for people to know is that we do have ups and downs, and it's not because one day you see me doing well that's always how it's going to be, and it's not because you're seeing me one day on a really low that I'm not able to do anything else that's considered normal, if you will. So it's just being able to understand that.
Kind of meet you where you're at in that moment, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So,
I think I would kind of have a comment to make, because Christelle makes a good point about the degree to which we should make children feel excluded or included, just even socially. And I feel that, you know, there's a degree of that when we see a child with maybe a disability that, you know, we're not trained to know how to interact with different people. So I think it's also just a matter of teaching other children to know how to interact with their peers, even though their peers might have a disability or might not have a disability. Because, you know, it's really children interacting with children at the end of the day. And I think like even just a little education on how to interact with other kids might be beneficial as well, speaking to that. Yeah.
That's a good point to bring up, because if I think back to like my childhood days, like going to elementary school, and when kids would be going to the gym class, I'll be put aside and do like arts and crafts or something as a replacement to not participating in gym class. And that like completely like segregated me from like other students, instead of like figuring out ways to adapt for me to participate in the sport. Because I remember when I started high school, for me to play soccer with friends, I would use my chair to kick the ball, right? Or like I would hit with my head I'd tell someone to throw the ball, and then I'd be able to hit with my head, and that was still a form of physical activity, and I was still integrated within the sports activity, and I'm still like meeting the requirements of like completing the grade, if you will. And kids will all say, "Oh, you don't have to do this. You're so lucky. You don't need to do gym. I hate gym." And that creates like, oh, you're being favored or you're being treated better because you have a disability.
Yeah.
It's such like a narrow-minded thing to say to somebody, not realizing all of the things you kind of sometimes have to deprive yourself from. It's insensitive and it's difficult because unfortunately they're children, right? So they have like a limited understanding of things in those types of situations or settings. Like I could, when I was a kid, seeing somebody with a disability it intrigued me very often, but I wouldn't know necessarily how to react or respond in an appropriate way. So I totally get the point that you're making, Sal. We have another question that came in from Paul from your brother. Do you find that you always have to prove to people that you can live a so-called normal life?
Every day.
Mm.
Every day. Because no matter what people have to say, I live my life, but there's always someone around that has something to say. If I push myself too much, then people end up telling me that, I need to slow down and I'm doing too much and I'm going to be in pain the next day. And then if I don't really do anything, then it's like, oh, okay, well, she's just, sick. But it's like, no, I'm being lazy. Like, I'm a normal person, I need my friend to push me, to motivate me, to encourage me, because we all need that. No matter what we deal with in life. And that's it. It's that sometimes people end up making excuses for you and saying that, you can't do that, or it's okay if you don't do that. You're like, no, I can, and I want to try, and I'm able to decide if I can't move on, if I can't meet the expectations, then I'll always pull back because I know my own limits. But I want to have that equal chance that every normal person has. And it's hard. It's hard because a lot of people end up, putting you on the side because you're the sick one.
I get it.
Yeah, people can have a really small, narrow mind, like we said. And when I hear all of this, I want to ask the question, how does this like affect you on a one-to-one? How has this affected you in your personal life, in the sense of, when do you want to talk to a person about something like this? When do you, how soon after meeting them, or how soon after, do you talk about something like this? I know you mentioned, that sometimes, on business, in terms of, the alcohol is sometimes an entry point there, but I mean on a personal level, when do you want to talk about something like that?
I usually wait for an opportunity to come up. It's not like, hey, I'm Christelle, nice to meet you, and here are all the problems in my life, right? I mean, it's it's really what it comes down to. It's seeking that opportunity. Sometimes you create it, sometimes it comes to you. I think it really falls back on how open a person is to listening. And what I actually really appreciated about this whole quarantine, this whole COVID-19 thing that we've been going through, is the fact that I kind of got highlighted as someone who is immunosuppressed. A lot of times, people kind of treated me like I was paranoid because I have my hand sanitizer with me. I'm washing my hands. I'm being careful about certain things. And that's the thing, is that COVID-19 or no COVID-19, like, I live this life on a daily basis. So I have to be careful. When it's flu season, just the regular flu, I'm super, super vulnerable to that. And I have to be really careful. And most people pre-COVID-19 just really did not have an understanding of that. It was like, oh, it's just the flu. It's fine. Don't worry. I get hit triple hard if I do end up getting sick. It's harder for me to bounce back. And so just those things, I'm really grateful for the fact that all of this has happened. So that has kind of opened up the conversation, and it's allowed me to talk to some people who didn't know I was sick, to let them know a little bit of what it is that I deal with. But most of the time I really wait for an opportunity in getting to know the person and getting to see, how judgmental or not they are. Because it can be really detrimental also to open up the conversation with the wrong person. They'll take the information, they'll pass it on to the next guy, and I've seen this, in the workplace is my prime example. And next thing you know, you have this whole story created about what you're really dealing with, and it has nothing to do with the truth. So it's really about taking time to listen and seeing that you have that person willing to do so.
Mm-hmm. So Sal, I know that you had a little bit of a technical difficulty. So this was the question. You find that you always have to prove to people that you can live a so-called normal life.
It's kind of interesting, actually, because, on one hand, I have to prove to people that I have a disability, which means that before they did assume that I could live a normal life. Then after describing what I've gone through and I am going through, sometimes they'll be like, okay, but now can you live a normal life? So it's always interesting. So I have to prove myself in a lot of different ways. I think I have, and usually what I tell them is, the usual thing. I'm still going on.
Oh no!
Oh no, we lost Sal.
Chriselle, this is what you're talking about in Zoom meetings, right? For those of you who don't know, we're talking about some of the challenges of COVID-19 and meeting with bosses, and sometimes when their cameras freeze in an awkward position. Hopefully, Sal will be back with us shortly.
Yeah. Krista, I'd like to go back on one question. I know you were talking about how it took a while for doctors to figure out the diagnosis, etc. I'm just curious, do you feel that, let's say, if you were not a person of color, would they have reached a diagnosis, would have taken your disability more seriously, that you are going through something, this is something that really should be looked into? Or do you think that wouldn't have changed regardless of your ethnicity?
I have to say that even though it did take a long time to diagnose, I was really, really, really blessed with an amazing team of doctors. Yes, it took time. Yes, it was frustrating. The one thing I always had on my side was, well, first of all, we live in Montreal, and in Quebec, just to have a family doctor is a miracle. Right. So I had a family doctor. I was lucky to have one. And she believed me. Despite every negative test that kept coming back, she truly believed the fact that I was suffering, that I was in pain, and that there was something wrong. And she stood by me all the way until I got diagnosed. And without that, I honestly don't know at all how things would have ended up for me, because in the process, I was sent to specialists and different doctors for second opinions, third opinions, or trying different things out. And I did come across some doctors who just thought, oh, she's going through growing pains. It'll end up leaving eventually. So just kind of deal with it, and that's it. So for me, my greatest ally really was having a doctor who did believe that I did have pain, despite the fact that it wasn't showing anywhere. So I think in this case, I can't really say that who I am, what I look like, or any of that came into play. If I had a different story, I would definitely be happy to share it, whether it's negative or positive. But I think in this case, it was really just having somebody that believe the pain. And to be honest, that's something that I know is very difficult to have and to come across.
Regardless of the results.
Yeah. What was the turning point? I mean, why? we can't answer why it took 7 years, but what was the turning point in terms of finally getting a diagnosis?
I was treated actually. So I was first referred to a rheumatologist who I stayed with for a few years. Unfortunately, he was more of a pill pusher than anything. So he, when I say I came across some people who really cared, and I also came across some who didn't care as much. After a few years of being treated and nothing happening, and still being in the same pain and not knowing why, it was just kind of like, hey, let's try this med, and then kind of going back and forth with that. My family doctor ended up referring me to another rheumatologist, and that's when, with time, it still did take time, we ended up concluding all my different diagnoses. So what happened with arthritis is that you kind of see the results on blood tests, but in my case, at the beginning, they were very faint. So it was like, okay, well, you do have it a little bit, it does show up, but not enough to give me the formal diagnosis. And then my other test came back negative for everything else. So the turning point really was starting to see another rheumatologist who's my specialist that follows me to this day. And again, he was someone who genuinely cared and took the time and told me that no matter how long it would take, that he would continue testing, he would continue seeking, trying different options to help, but also seeking different avenues of what I could actually be dealing with. It's very difficult when you show up to the doctors and you say, I have pain from head to toe 24/7. If I show up and I say I have pain specifically here or there, and it's triggered by this or that, it narrows it down a little bit more. If it shows up on an x-ray or shows up on an MRI, it's a lot easier. But when you show up with generalized pain, which is really what fibromyalgia is, it's a lot more difficult, and fibromyalgia is usually diagnosed through a process of elimination, and that's also what ends up taking time. Is that you check for this, you check for that, you try this treatment, you try that treatment, and finally you say, okay, well, this is what it is, and now you start targeting your coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
I had a slightly similar experience to that, in the sense of having doctors not take something that you're addressing with them, I guess, I don't want to say seriously, but for lack of a better term, seriously. And this is with my youngest when she was kind of going through a phase where she had eczema like head to toe, and it was really bad. And, we went to doctors. The doctors were just like, oh, some kids just have it. And we suspected that there was an allergy behind it. At least in our case, we were able to pinpoint a specific thing. Like, wife feeds her after having consumed a lot of milk. Then she breaks out into hives head to toe. So we think that maybe there's something in the milk. But in your case, I can't imagine how frustrating it must be to go to a doctor and have them kind of just, not brush you off, but then either suggest, okay, well, take these pills and try to see how this helps you cope with the situation, And when you combine that too, I think with you look at the fact that there's also, you're contending with people that sometimes go to the doctor and they're seeking narcotics, right? So it's like, did you encounter anything like that where the doctors were maybe kind of discrediting what you were saying, maybe based on like suspicions or weird things like that?
In terms of, because I wanted access to meds and all that, no. However, because of my youth, yes.
Okay.
See, I started having pains around the age of 8, 9, just more sporadic, and then it became chronic at the age of 15. And obviously, at the age of 15, you're an adolescent, your body's going through so many changes. And what happened is that I would see specialists, and most of the time they would just discredit me and just throw it all on that. When I was talking about growing pains, that's exactly what I meant. It's not because I was looking for narcotics. I wasn't at that age or anything like that. I was showing up to my appointments with my mom still, so it wasn't that the case at all, but it was really more of, well, I'm just like, I'm the little fragile diva princess of the house, and I broke a nail, and that's kind of how I was being treated, more than like it's serious pain. And then when I started stopping having regular nights of sleep, I think my family got to see as well that it wasn't just fun and games and me being dramatic, but I was literally staying up all night in pain. And I think that's kind of what helped me get a little bit more credibility. But I look at the title of this conversation, am I disabled enough? A lot of times I felt like I wasn't enough to be taken seriously. And you don't want to exaggerate. You're seeing doctors, you have to be honest so they could treat you properly. So you don't want to exaggerate your pain, but sometimes you feel like you have to, because if you don't, well, it's like, well, just go home. It's going to be okay, you know?
I get you.
It's interesting, like different worlds, because like for me, example, I would say that I've had to like suppress any of like the symptoms that I have, because I was always kind of like the experiment that doctors wanted.
Oh my God.
Right. Because number one, I just came into Canada, right? I'm from Zimbabwe. Yeah, and on top of that, I had a physical disability. So it was like an opportunity to do all these experiments and find out, okay, what specific type of disability does this guy have? We know that like it's a form, it affects muscles, but we really want to know, right? And they're really like pulling for answers. They're really pulling for results.
Almost treating you like a guinea pig, like a human guinea
As a
pig.
guinea pig, essentially, right? And like my experience was like, okay, I should try and suppress like and not answer as much as possible, so that these guys can then leave me alone.
Yeah.
That's like for me, it was like a complete opposite. Yeah.
We have a question from Paul that came in. So for us viewers and other disabled individuals, what advice do you give to one to stay positive in spite of what people say or think?
Oh.
Coming with the heat.
Yeah. I love it. I think, you had mentioned that do we have to constantly convince people that we're able to live a normal life? I think what I realized with time is that I've set my own standard for normal, and I'm okay with that. And that's the only thing that matters. What you think I can or can't do, what you think I should or shouldn't do, honestly, doesn't matter. I have to deal with myself at the end of the day. I'm the one who has to deal with the pain. I'm the one who has to deal with the consequences of what I don't do or what I achieve. It could be both negative or positive. And I think what's important is just really to be comfortable in your own skin. Because no matter what you do, no matter what you say, people will always have something to say. They'll always have something to judge or critique. And what I'm saying right now applies to anybody in any context, to be honest. It's hey, this is my life. I'm going to live it. I'm going to live it no matter what you say or think about it. And obviously, I want to be an inspiration to others. Obviously, I want to be a good example and a role model. But the truth is that when it comes to dealing with my disability, it's what I can handle. There are moments in my life where I go to the gym 5 days a week and I'm bench pressing, I'm doing weights, I'm squatting, I'm doing all this stuff. I'm super muscled. And then there are moments in my life where I go 6 months in a row, barely stepping out of the house, just holding down the job and cutting every single other activity out. Not being able to work out, sometimes not being able to eat, losing all my muscle, losing a lot of weight. And those are just my personal realities. And I've come to terms with the fact that I have my ups and downs. And as long as I'm doing what I can do, sometimes it'll be a lot and sometimes it'll just be a little. But as long as you do what you can do, that's the most important thing.
So it's finding your, I don't want to say normal, but finding what your balance is and then accepting that as being your balance, your comfort.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Very cool.
We have a question that comes to us from outside of the network. This is a question from Mama Chase. She's watching, and she's asking, does Chriselle, does your condition get better with time? Does it affect your lifespan? What for this is new to her, so she's asking.
Yeah, I've had that question asked a lot, and shout out to Mama Chase.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Mama Chase is our mama, blatant my mama. Thanks for watching the podcast, Mom.
In terms of lifespan, no impact. In terms of the long term, it can be a degenerative disease. So fibromyalgia, arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis are indeed sicknesses that can get worse. Fibromyalgia is one that can be controlled just a little bit more, though. According to the foods that you eat, I mean, it's no secret that certain foods do encourage and provoke inflammation. So that's just a common fact. So obviously you can help yourself a little bit more or less according to what it is that you eat. However, some bodies are predisposed to just unfortunately kind of spiraling down and getting worse with time. So you can imagine that dealing with things like arthritis. I'm 34 years old right now. In 30 years, I hope to God that, you know, I'll still be able to do what I do, but it is known that those sicknesses do indeed, unfortunately get worse with time. So it's about balancing and being able to help yourself in any way that you can. So whether it's your lifestyle routine, in my case, what I do is I try to help my body stay strong by working out. It does help me, but you know, like I said, some days I can, some days I can't. But it's all those factors that help you deal with the long term, so that it can help a little bit slow down the progress of those sicknesses.
Mm-hmm.
I can answer a question that some people have also asked me, which some people are shy, but I've been asked as well, you know, if I can't have children, if I can deal with a pregnancy. The answer is yes. I am already telling myself that if I do get pregnant and have children one day, that definitely the pain will be a lot worse than what it currently is. But in terms of being able to have children, that's something that's not an issue at all.
Nice.
Nice.
Chris, man, you've always been, you know, that shining light. I've had a tremendous amount of respect for you and everything that you've done and do. You know, if it's not, you know, through the professional side as a director or in your personal life championing the cause, man, you know, you've been awesome and amazing to watch. So nothing but love and respect, you know, for you, you know, so that's my 2 cents for now.
Chris, just like in closing, what do you want people to take away with regards to people with invisible disabilities? What's one, if there's anything that people could take away throughout this entire hour, what's one thing that you want them to know and to understand about invisible disabilities?
I think the most important point in all of this, the greatest takeaway, is don't assume and don't just Google search and apply whatever it is that you find on the person that you're talking to. Take time to listen, take time to understand. Know that each person goes through something differently and has also, even in terms of pain, we have different, or in terms of different disability, we have different tolerance levels as well. And it's important to not just go ahead and assume that you know what it is that the person's going through, but take time to ask the person to understand better. And the second point I would bring about is also, don't forget that we all have some sort of a battle in life. Mine happens to be invisible. Yours gift is very visible, or at least part of it is visible. And Dwight and Terry, you know, you guys might look like you don't have any of what it is that I'm dealing with, but the truth is that maybe you do, and you haven't spoken about it. And that's one thing that I really learned with time, was that I've learned compassion and empathy in dealing with people, because someone who shows up at work in the morning and shows up in a bad mood and bad attitude and all that, with what I have, I've learned that I can't just go ahead and assume that they're just being dumb, but maybe they're going through something. Maybe they just got diagnosed with cancer. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they're going through some sort of issue that I have no idea about. And so what I'm saying now, applies more globally, but I think it's really important for us, even for people with disabilities, to just not assume anything and really take time to get to know the people, and avoid judgment as much as possible.
Wow.
So it's created kind of a place for empathy for people going through different experiences. I think that's very profound, extremely profound. Yeah.
And
That's my job, you ask me. Well said. Honestly, well said. Yeah.
Chris, we want to make sure that we give you the floor in terms of anything you might want to bring. I know what you do already, but give you the chance. Maybe you want to share some of the things you're involved with, and give you the opportunity to share that here.
Sure. I do a lot, and at the same time, I don't do that much. I don't know. I think I do have one cause that's very close to my heart, which has always been. So I'm an advocate for Compassion International. It's a child sponsorship organization, and that's a cause that's very dear to my heart. Mostly because of where my father comes from. He's from the Philippines, and because of that, I've been exposed to the truth and reality of what growing up in poverty really is all about. I haven't personally directly lived it myself, but I do know a lot more about it, because my father comes from one of the poorest countries in the world. So that's definitely one of the causes that I am involved in. That's very close to me, but I use social media otherwise to post every now and then, a little bit more to raise awareness about the sicknesses and the challenges that I do live with, and that's really out of pure, I guess I wouldn't say passion. It's not really a passion to be sick, but just wanting to help people be more compassionate towards others, and really give space for us to be more human, to be more kind. I love, unfortunately, the circumstances of the last week have, been very difficult, but I love what has come out of it. The fact that people have been more open to listening. I think listening is such a powerful tool, and something that we can all do that only costs us time. And if we take time to listen to people, there's so much that we can get out of it.
Wow.
I definitely agree. I think we didn't realize how fragile life was until everybody had to hunker down at home and kind of just wait to see what tomorrow's going to bring, So it's cool. So if you want, in the comments, if you have any links or anything like that to any websites, Christelle, please feel free to share them, so that people can kind of get to familiarize themselves a little bit more with that endeavor.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Christelle, for
thanks for joining us.
time and sharing. Yeah.
And also,
thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Mama Chase shouts back at you, saying, "God be with you, Chris. We love you." So
thank you.
A little word
Thank
from
you so much, guys. You're awesome, and thank you for thinking of me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for making the time for us. And also, we want to make sure that we shout out Sal as well too. Sal unfortunately had a few technical difficulties, but it was really cool. No, he wasn't abducted. He's not out protesting. He just had problems with internet tonight. So we thank you so much for joining us, Sal. And we just want to also thank you for sharing your experience with us. And we hope maybe at another time we can have you guys back to further discuss these topics. And I just want to also take a moment to shout out a few people who reached out to us. So we have Marissa Hart, who said hello to us a little bit earlier. So thanks for watching, Marissa. Yeah. And there was somebody else I saw in the comment. Oh, Mr. Paul Simon. Yes. I'm wondering if this is the artist.
No, it's a very supportive boyfriend of mine.
Okay, nice. Well, thanks for watching us, Paul. We appreciate it, and we're happy to see why Christelle is smiling so much. Yeah, so good stuff.
As he's so Paul's sons, my man's inspired. Love it.
Cool. Yeah. So thank you guys very much for joining us tonight and watching this episode. One other thing I just want to mention. So why this topic kind of spoke to me so much is because not only like a little bit what I do for work and stuff, but I had watched a documentary recently which I found really interesting called Crip Camp.
Yeah.
It's on Netflix, okay,
Yeah.
and it talks about essentially a summer camp. You know, students, kids who went to a summer camp that was for people with disabilities, and how their bonding together at that camp led to them literally becoming the people responsible for the adoption of ADA codes. And since we find ourselves in a moment of revolution right now, where people are standing up for causes, I found it so interesting to see how these people that people overlooked in society were able to literally take siege of a government office and make sure that they were heard. So I'm going to share the link to the trailer in our chat, but
Yeah.
please feel free if you have Netflix to check it out because it's well worth the watch. It's really a very heartwarming documentary to take a look at. So it comes with high recommendations from myself.
Yes.
Thank you.
No worries. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys for all watching, and please make sure you share the videos. We appreciate you guys interacting with us and asking questions in real time, and we're going to keep doing this. So
Join us next week.
Yeah, join us next week.
Thank you so much.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody. Good night.